On Christmas night, a dog saves a family from a fire. How he did it will leave you speechless. The fire was spreading fast. Emma rushed to the kitchen, her hands shaking as she tried to grab the fire extinguisher, but the flames had already reached the cabinets. Smoke filled the air, thick and suffocating. She turned to shout for Mark, but the smoke made it impossible to see anything. The loud beeping of the smoke detector filled the house, but it was drowned out by the roar of the fire creeping closer. Lucy, her daughter, stood frozen in the hallway, her eyes wide with fear. "Mom," she screamed, but Emma couldn't hear her over the chaos. The heat was unbearable. The fire had spread so quickly. In a panic, Emma grabbed Lucy's hand and tried to pull her toward the back door, but the kitchen was already too dangerous. And then Tor, the golden retriever, appeared. He rushed to Emma's side, barking furiously. His fur was soaked with sweat, but his eyes were focused and determined. Without hesitation, he nudged Lucy, urging her to follow him. Emma looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. It was as if Tor knew exactly what to do. The dog barked again, this time more urgently, and then bolted toward the stairs. "Come on," Emma shouted to Mark, who was trying to reach them from the living room, but the fire had already started to block the path. Tor didn't wait for instructions. He darted upstairs, with Lucy now following him closely. "Mark, we need to get out of here," Emma screamed, but he couldn't hear her over the smoke. The heat was unbearable. She grabbed Lucy's arm and turned, running toward the stairwell where Tor was already waiting. But then she stopped. The smoke had become thicker and the heat was too much. Her breath came in ragged gasps and she could feel her legs weakening. It wasn't just a fire, it was a trap, one they had no way of escaping. And just then Tor barked again. Louder this time. Without a second thought, Emma and Lucy followed Tor down the hallway, their only hope now resting on the dog's instinct to guide them to safety. The moment they reached the hallway, Emma's mind raced, her thoughts spinning. She knew the back door was too far, and the windows were already surrounded by flames. Every step felt like a fight for survival, the heat pushing them forward but also pulling them back like an invisible force. Tor's barks echoed through the smoke-filled air, sharp and insistent. He wasn't just guiding them, he was leading them with purpose. Emma could barely see, but she trusted Tor completely. She reached out and grabbed Lucy's hand again. "Stay close," she whispered, the words barely escaping her throat. Tor was ahead, running down the hall like a beacon of hope. His golden coat shimmered faintly in the dim light of the house, his movements swift and precise. He turned into the living room and Emma followed, dragging Lucy along with her. "Mark?" Emma shouted, but there was no answer. The house was alive with the sound of crackling wood and falling debris. Mark had been in the living room just moments ago, but now it felt like they were in an entirely different world, a world consumed by fire. "Mom, I'm scared." Lucy's voice broke through the chaos and Emma's heart sank. Her little girl had never sounded so vulnerable. Emma squeezed her hand tighter and forced herself to stay calm, even though her every instinct screamed for her to panic. Tor stopped at the front door, his body blocking the way as if telling Emma not to try. He barked once, then ran to the side, pushing against the living room window. The glass was intact, but the heat was making it unbearable to even get close. Emma could feel the intensity of the flames creeping from behind, but Tor didn't move. Not yet, she thought. Not yet. The family couldn't give up now. But how would they get out? Tor barked again, more urgently now. It was a command, not just a call. Emma looked at Lucy, trying to calm her with a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We need to trust Tor," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. The dog had been more than a pet. He had become their protector. And in that moment, it felt as though Tor was the only one who knew what to do. Emma didn't hesitate. She pulled Lucy toward the back of the house, Tor leading them, his every step firm, guiding them toward safety. The smoke thickened, stinging her eyes and clogging her lungs, but there was no turning back now. With each step, Emma felt the weight of the fire on her shoulders, but Tor's presence gave her something to hold on to, a thread of hope in a nightmare. They reached the back hallway, but it was no longer the familiar space Emma had known. The smoke was suffocating, clinging to every surface, twisting the air into a dense fog that made it almost impossible to breathe. The heat was unbearable, pressing down on her chest with every breath she took. Lucy's hand, still tightly gripped in hers, was cold against the rising warmth of the house. Tor didn't slow down. He ran ahead, his golden fur barely visible in the haze. Emma forced herself to keep moving, one step at a time, but it felt like time was slipping away, like the fire was swallowing everything they had once known. "Where's Mark?" Lucy asked, her voice fragile, breaking Emma's focus for a moment. Her daughter's words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had tried to stay calm to reassure Lucy, but the truth was she didn't know where Mark was. He had been right behind them moments ago, but now the house seemed to be swallowing him whole. "Mom?" Lucy repeated, pulling on Emma's sleeve. "I'm right here," Emma answered quickly, trying to mask the fear in her voice. "We're going to be okay, Lucy. Just keep following Tor." Tor's steady movements became the only thing Emma could focus on. He had already cleared the stairs ahead, barking once before darting into the kitchen. Emma followed as best as she could, but the path was narrowing, and the door to the backyard was still far out of reach. Then, with a suddenness that startled Emma, Tor stopped dead in his tracks, his tail straight as an arrow. He turned, looking back at Emma and Lucy, eyes wide and focused. "Go," he seemed to say, the command clear in his movements. He ran back toward the kitchen, his body blocking Emma's path for a moment before he darted to the side, urging her to follow. Emma hesitated for just a moment, confusion overwhelming her. But then a faint sound reached her ears, a series of faint, distant sirens. The realization hit her like a wave. The neighbors had heard the fire. Help was on the way. She looked at Tor, and for the first time since the fire had started, she felt a glimmer of something other than fear. It wasn't just survival anymore, it was hope. Tor had somehow known the fire's path, and more than that, he had been guiding them toward a way out. "Thank you," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the fire. The dog had brought them this far. His instincts had kept them alive. And now the sirens grew louder, closer. But even with help just around the corner, Emma knew that their fight was not over. The flames were still closing in, and the house was collapsing around them. But as long as Tor was by their side, there was hope. There was always hope. The air was thick with smoke, and Emma could feel the heat radiating from the walls. The sirens outside were no longer distant. They were close, but not close enough. Every second felt like a lifetime. The door to the backyard seemed so far away, yet it felt like the only escape they had. Tor's barking had stopped, and Emma could feel her heart pounding in her chest as they stood at the edge of the living room, surrounded by fire. "Come on," Emma shouted, but the words barely left her lips as she felt the weight of the smoke pressing down. Lucy, still holding her hand, was struggling to keep up. The heat from the fire was too much, and Emma could see the panic creeping into her daughter's eyes. "Mom, I can't breathe," Lucy whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling flames. Emma knelt beside her, pulling Lucy close, trying to shield her from the heat. "We're almost there," she promised, her voice trembling, though she couldn't be sure of it. Every instinct in her screamed to get out, to run, to leave this nightmare behind. But the path was blocked. And just when Emma thought they couldn't go any further, Tor appeared again. He had gone ahead, pushing through the smoke, and now he stood in front of the door to the backyard, barking fiercely. It was as if he was telling them it was safe to go, showing them the way. Emma's heart soared with relief. She grabbed Lucy's hand once more and started toward the door. The heat was unbearable, but the thought of escape, of safety, pushed her forward. Tor stepped aside, allowing them through, his watchful eyes scanning the space behind them, never once turning away. "Good boy, Tor," Emma whispered, her voice shaking with gratitude. The dog barked again, but this time his tail wagged just slightly. He turned and, without hesitation, darted to the side of the house. Emma, still gripping Lucy's hand, followed as quickly as she could. The yard was smaller than she remembered, and the bushes had started to catch fire, the flames licking at the edges of the property. They couldn't stay in the yard much longer. But Tor didn't stop. He kept moving, his instincts leading them further away from the flames, toward the front of the house. Emma followed, praying that they would make it to safety before the fire consumed everything in its path. Just a little further, Emma muttered to herself. "We can do this." They reached the front of the house, and Emma could hear the faint sound of sirens once again. Tor had guided them to the safest part of the yard, away from the worst of the fire. The path was clear, but the danger wasn't over yet. The flames still raged behind them, and Emma knew they had mere moments before the house would be completely gone. But Tor stood still, looking back toward the house as if waiting for something. A few seconds later, the first fire truck arrived, its sirens deafening as it screeched to a halt in front of the house. Firefighters rushed out, their movements precise and coordinated, ready to tackle the blaze. Emma turned to Tor, her eyes full of gratitude. "You did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The dog had led them to safety, but his work wasn't done. He had saved their lives, and now he was waiting for the rescue he had known was coming all along. The fire trucks arrived in a flurry of activity, their sirens blaring, drowning out the crackling chaos behind them. Firefighters rushed toward the house, their boots pounding the ground with urgency. Emma felt a rush of relief, but the weight of the night still hung heavily in her chest. She couldn't let herself believe they were safe yet. There was still so much uncertainty, so much left to be done. Tor stood motionless, his eyes never leaving the house. His golden fur shimmered in the pale light of the street lamps, but there was no time to admire him. Emma glanced down at Lucy, who was now clinging to her side, still shaken but trying to stay strong. "Mom, is Daddy okay?" Lucy asked, her voice trembling as she looked toward the house, her small face full of fear. Emma squeezed her daughter's hand, unsure of how to answer. The fear that had been building in her chest since the fire first began had now taken root in her stomach. Mark hadn't made it out yet. He hadn't come with them when they left the house. And Emma had no idea where he was. "Your dad is strong, Lucy," she said, her voice a little too steady for her own liking. "He's probably helping the firefighters." But even as she spoke the words, Emma couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in her gut. The fire was still raging, and with every passing minute, she feared the worst. Tor suddenly shifted, his body tensing as he took a few steps toward the firefighters who were now organizing, preparing to tackle the fire head-on. He stopped, then turned, his eyes locking onto Emma's with a clear purpose. Without another moment's hesitation, he darted back toward the house, his movements swift and determined. "Tor?" Emma cried, fear flooding her voice. But the dog didn't stop. He bolted toward the front door, the heat still radiating from the structure behind him. "Tor, no?" Emma shouted, but it was too late. Tor had already disappeared into the smoke. The firefighters seemed oblivious, busy preparing for the battle ahead, but Emma's heart leaped into her throat. She couldn't let him go back in there. She couldn't lose him after everything he had done to keep them safe. Without thinking, Emma pulled Lucy's hand and ran after him, her legs trembling as she pushed past the fire truck, dodging the fire hoses and equipment. "Mom, stop!" Lucy cried, but Emma couldn't hear her. Her only focus was the dog, the golden retriever who had saved their lives more times than she could count. She couldn't let him face the flames alone. She reached the edge of the front porch just as Tor reappeared, coming out of the smoke, his body covered in ash, his eyes wide and frantic. In his mouth he carried something small, something wrapped in his mouth so carefully as though he was cradling it. Emma froze in shock. Tor dropped the bundle at her feet, and as the smoke cleared, she saw what it was. It was Mark's jacket. Tor's eyes locked with hers, and for a moment, everything stopped. There was no more fire, no more smoke. Just a deep understanding between them. Emma sank to her knees, the tears finally flowing freely down her cheeks. Mark's jacket meant he had been inside, and that meant he was still alive. "Tor, you brought him back," Emma whispered, her voice breaking. The dog had gone back into the flames not just to save her, but to bring Mark home too. In that moment, Emma knew they were truly safe. The firefighters were here. The house would burn, but they had survived. Tor had saved them all. The house loomed in front of them, a shell of its former self. Smoke still poured from the windows, and the fire had left its mark, turning everything it touched to ash. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Mark was alive. Tor had saved him. Emma cradled the jacket in her arms, feeling its weight, her husband's familiar scent still lingering faintly on the fabric. Her hands trembled as she looked back at the house, her mind racing to understand how it all happened. How had Tor known exactly where to go? How had he found Mark in that inferno? The sound of footsteps behind her brought her back to the present. She turned to see Mark, covered in soot, his face smudged with dirt but his eyes full of relief. He moved slowly as if each step was a small victory. "Emma," he said, his voice hoarse, barely audible over the distant crackling of the fire. "Lucy, are you okay?" Tears welled up in Emma's eyes as she rushed to him, wrapping her arms around him tightly, not caring about the soot or the ash that clung to his clothes. "I was so scared," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought I lost you." Mark held her just as tightly, his own emotions raw. "I wasn't going to let that happen. Not without you and Lucy." He pulled back slightly to look at her, his gaze shifting to Lucy, who was standing a few feet away, holding on to Tor's collar. The dog was standing still, his eyes gentle, as if he understood the weight of the moment. Mark knelt down in front of Lucy, who was now crying softly. He placed a hand on her shoulder and smiled through his own tears. "Hey, you're okay. We're all okay." Lucy sniffled, wiping her eyes. "Tor saved us, Daddy. He saved us from the fire." Mark looked at the dog, his expression filled with awe. "I know he did," he said softly. "He's a hero just like you too." Emma watched as Mark hugged their daughter, feeling a profound sense of gratitude and relief wash over her. They had been through hell and back, but they were together. They were alive. And it was all because of Tor. The firefighters were now fully engaged, hosing down the remains of the house, ensuring the flames wouldn't spread. But Emma couldn't take her eyes off Tor. The golden retriever had given them something they could never repay: his unwavering loyalty, his bravery, his love. "Thank you, Tor," Emma whispered, walking over to him and kneeling down beside the dog. She stroked his fur, her hands still shaking from the adrenaline. "You saved us. You saved our family." Tor's tail wagged softly as if he understood every word. He nuzzled her hand, and in that moment, Emma felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The nightmare was over. They had survived, and it was because of this one remarkable dog. As the fire was finally contained, Emma stood, her family now complete again. They had lost their home, but they hadn't lost each other. And with Tor by their side, they knew they could rebuild anything, together. Mark stood beside her, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "We'll be okay," he said, his voice steady. "We'll start over. Together." Emma nodded, her gaze lingering on Tor, who was now resting quietly at her feet. "Yes," she whispered. "Together." And as the flames died down, the warmth of Christmas returned, not because of the tree or the lights or the presents, but because of the love and courage that had carried them through the darkest night of their lives. As the last embers of the fire died down, the night began to settle, leaving behind a heavy stillness in the air. The sirens were fading, and the firefighters, though exhausted, continued to move about, assessing the damage. But for Emma, Mark, Lucy, and Tor, the world outside the fire was still a blur. They stood together, their faces weary but full of gratitude, each of them understanding the weight of what they had survived. Tor lay at their feet, his body covered in ash, his once gleaming coat now dull with soot. His eyes, however, remained bright and alert, as though he was still on guard, watching over them. But unlike the frantic energy he had shown earlier, there was now a peacefulness in his posture, a quiet acknowledgement that his job was done. Emma crouched down beside him, her fingers gently brushing through his fur. The softness of his coat contrasted with the harsh reality of what they had just been through. She couldn't find the words to express what she felt. There weren't enough words. All she could do was hold his head in her hands, her eyes filled with tears that had no place left to fall. "You're our hero, Tor," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Mark stood next to her, a hand resting on her shoulder. He too was looking at Tor, his face lined with exhaustion but softened by the incredible gratitude he felt. He hadn't realized just how much they had relied on the dog, how much Tor had truly protected them, until this very moment. It wasn't just about saving them from the fire, it was about saving their family, about preserving the life they had fought so hard to build. "I don't know how he did it," Mark said quietly. "He was amazing. I don't know what we would have done without him." Emma didn't respond right away. She was still kneeling beside Tor, her fingers caressing his worn fur. He was breathing softly now, his body tired but not defeated. It wasn't the first time he had saved them. It wasn't the first time he had put his own safety aside for their well-being. But tonight, it felt like he had gone beyond what anyone could expect. He had been their protector when the world around them was falling apart. Lucy, still holding onto Tor's collar, knelt down beside him too. "You're the best dog ever," she said, her voice full of love and admiration. Her words, though simple, carried the weight of everything they had been through. Emma smiled at her daughter's innocent words. "Yes, he is," she agreed softly. "The best dog ever." And as they stood there, surrounded by the remnants of the life they once knew, Emma realized that the real gift of Christmas wasn't found in the presents or the decorations. It was in the moments that tested them, the moments when they were forced to confront their deepest fears and rely on each other. It was in the love of a dog who had given everything to save them, who had placed his trust in them and proven that sometimes, the greatest heroes come in the most unexpected forms. Tor looked up at them, his tail wagging gently. The fire had stolen their home, but it had not stolen their family, not as long as they had each other, and as long as they had Tor, who had shown them the true meaning of courage. Emma stood up, brushing the ashes from her knees. "We'll rebuild," she said, her voice steady now, her heart full. "And we'll do it together." Mark nodded, his arm once again around her. Together. They all looked at the remains of their house, the charred foundation, the roof now collapsed. It was gone, but they still had each other. And they still had Tor, their hero. With him by their side, they could face anything. As the night grew quiet, the first stars began to appear in the sky, their soft light shimmering in the distance. Emma looked up, a sense of peace washing over her. For the first time in a long while, she felt the true spirit of Christmas, not in the joy of a perfect holiday, but in the strength they had found in each other, in the courage that had carried them through the darkest of nights. Together they would rebuild. Together they would survive. And together they would always have Tor, their Christmas miracle. The fire had stolen their home, but it had not stolen their hope. As the first light of dawn broke through the dark sky, the family stood together, their bodies sore, their hearts full. They had survived the unthinkable, and in that survival they had found something deeper, something that could never be burned away. The firefighters had done their work, and the remains of the house had been secured. The scene was a somber one, a house that had once been filled with laughter and love now reduced to charred wood and smoldering ruins. But amidst the devastation there was a quiet strength. The fire had ravaged their material belongings, but it hadn't touched their souls. It hadn't broken the bond that held them together. Emma looked at Mark, her gaze steady despite the exhaustion in her bones. "We're alive," she said, her voice carrying a weight of finality, but also something else. An understanding that this moment, the one they had just lived through, had irrevocably changed them. Mark nodded, his arms still around her shoulders. "We are. And we have each other." Lucy, standing beside them, looked up at her parents. She was quieter than usual, her eyes wide as she took in the devastation, but her hand never left Tor's fur. The dog, who had once been her playful companion, was now something more, a symbol of unwavering protection, of courage when all seemed lost. His golden coat was still streaked with ash, but his eyes were clear, full of understanding, as if he knew his job was done. "Are we going to stay here?" Lucy asked, her voice soft, uncertain. Emma knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "No, sweetie," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "We won't stay here. But we'll rebuild. We'll make a new home, together." Mark looked down at Tor, his eyes full of gratitude. "Tor saved us all. He's our hero." Emma smiled, her heart full as she placed a hand on the dog's head. Tor's tail wagged gently as if acknowledging the praise. His silence spoke volumes. He had done what no one could have asked for, and now he rested. His loyalty, his bravery had carried them through the worst of it. "I think he already knows," Emma whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We owe him everything." They stood together for a moment longer, the weight of the night slowly sinking in. The fire had taken their home, but it had given them something much more precious, each other, and a bond that could not be broken. The chaos of the past hours felt like a distant memory now, a nightmare they had all faced and survived. "We'll figure it out," Mark said, his voice steady. "One step at a time." Emma nodded, her gaze moving from Mark to Lucy and then back to Tor. The path ahead was uncertain, but they would face it together. The house could be rebuilt. The loss could be mourned. But the love between them, this unbreakable bond, was something that could never be taken away. Lucy looked up at her parents, her face softening as she smiled for the first time since the fire started. "Can we get a new Christmas tree?" Emma laughed softly, the sound a mix of relief and warmth. "Of course we can, sweetie. We'll make it the best Christmas tree ever." Mark laughed too, the sound of it a little rusty but filled with hope. "I think we've earned the best one, don't you?" They all looked toward the horizon as the sun began to rise higher, casting a soft golden light over the remains of their home. The road ahead would be long, but they had already come so far. With Tor by their side, they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. Emma squeezed Mark's hand, her heart full. Together. And as the sun bathed them in its warm light, Emma knew that they would rebuild, not just a house but their life, their family, stronger than ever. The Christmas miracle had come in the form of a dog, one who had saved their lives and given them a second chance. And that was all they needed to begin again. The days after the fire were a blur, filled with the chaos of sorting through the wreckage, making calls to insurance companies and finding a temporary place to stay. But through it all, the one constant, the one source of unwavering strength, was Tor. Every morning as Emma and Mark faced the daunting task of rebuilding their lives, Tor was there, by their side, offering his silent comfort, his presence a reminder that they had already overcome the most impossible obstacle. The Christmas season, once marked by joy and expectation, had taken on a new meaning. The decorations had been destroyed, the tree lost to the flames, but Emma and Mark both knew something that their daughter, Lucy, had yet to understand. The real gift of Christmas wasn't found in the gifts or the tree. It wasn't about the lights or the holiday meals. It was in the moments they shared, the love they gave, and the family they had fought so hard to keep together. One chilly evening, just days before Christmas, Emma and Mark sat together on the small porch of their temporary home, looking out at the horizon. The cold air bit at their skin, but they didn't mind. They had each other. The warmth of the bond they shared was enough to ward off the chill. "Do you think it'll ever feel like Christmas again?" Emma asked softly, her gaze distant as she watched the sky turn from blue to gray. Mark turned to her, his eyes soft but full of resolve. "I think it already does," he said, his voice steady, carrying a weight of conviction. "It's not about the house, Emma. It's about what we have, what we've learned, and what we've kept safe." Emma smiled, the corners of her lips turning up despite the overwhelming exhaustion. "And what about Tor?" she asked, glancing at the golden retriever who was lying peacefully at their feet, his head resting on his paws. Mark chuckled. "Well, he's definitely part of our Christmas miracle." Emma nodded. "He really is." Just then, Lucy came running outside, her little face lighting up with a grin that hadn't been seen in days. She was holding a small, scraggly little Christmas tree, a real one not much bigger than herself, but to her it was perfect. "We did it," she exclaimed, her voice full of pride. "It's not much, but I thought it was the perfect tree for us." Emma and Mark exchanged a smile, their hearts swelling with emotion. In that moment they saw the truth in their daughter's eyes. Christmas wasn't about the grand things, the perfect moments, it was about what they made of the time they had. It was about love and family and the strength to keep going no matter what. Mark stood up and took the tree from Lucy's hands, carefully placing it in a corner of their porch. "It's perfect, sweetheart," he said. "Absolutely perfect." They all gathered around the tree, the tiny lights that adorned it glowing softly in the evening light. Tor stood beside them, his tail wagging as if he too understood that this simple moment, this humble tree, meant something far more than what it appeared. Emma took Lucy's hand, holding it tightly. "This is our Christmas," she said, her voice steady. "This is the Christmas we'll remember forever." Mark nodded, wrapping an arm around both of them. "The best Christmas we've ever had. Because we have each other. And we have Tor." Lucy smiled up at them, her eyes sparkling with hope. "I love you both," she whispered. "And we love you more than anything," Emma replied, pulling her close. Tor gave a soft bark and Emma and Mark both laughed, their hearts full. In the quiet of that night, surrounded by the soft glow of their small tree and the warmth of their family, they knew the truth. They had survived the fire and now they would rebuild. Not just their home but their lives, their love and their bond. And it was enough. The fire had taken many things, but it hadn't taken what mattered most. And as they stood together, watching the flickering lights of their tiny Christmas tree, they knew that this Christmas would be the one they would always remember. The Christmas that proved they could endure anything as long as they were together. Together they had everything. And with Tor by their side, they had a family, a home, and a Christmas that would forever be etched in their hearts. True strength isn't in what we have, but in what we overcome together. Tor, with his unwavering loyalty, reminds us that even in the hardest moments, it's love, courage, and unity that keep us standing. It doesn't matter what we lose, what matters is what we choose to save. If this story touched your heart and made you reflect on the true spirit of Christmas, share this moment with those you love. Comment below on what you learned from this journey of resilience, and if you haven't already, join us for more stories that remind us of the strength within us all. Like, share, and subscribe, because together we are stronger.